Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paul Adamson. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this very first event in 2022 of the EUK Forum. Before I introduce my guest for today's webinar, let me just quickly remind you about what the EUK Forum is all about. It's an exercise, a structure to make sure that the two sides, the UK, keep on talking despite any political tensions which may be happening at the background. And it's a forum for debate, discussion, dialogue. And we very much welcome your ideas, insights, and any suggestions you may have on what we might do in the future. And just to point out that as we're finding our feet, we're over 15, 16 months old now. We are, in addition to our monthly webinars that you're all very welcome to join as you are today, we are reaching out and partnering more and more with all sorts of variety of organizations, both public sector and private sector. So if you have any ideas about how we can partner with you in this new year, do get in touch with me. We're here to talk about UK relations and the prospects thereof in this new year. And I'm delighted to welcome my guest and my good friend, Professor Anand Menon, who's director of the UK The Changing Europe project, based in King's College, London. And welcome to, and then join me on the screen, Anand. It'd be nice to see you.
Hi, Paul.
Great to have you here, and thank you for doing this. You were quite a hit at our annual conference back in July, so I thought we'd have you back. I'm sure it was the quality of the questions as much as the answers which made it such a success. But let's see if we can do a repeat performance, my friend, okay? We're here to talk about the future, not about the past, obviously, but there has been, of course, over the Christmas period, a changing of the guard in the UK political scene with the resignation of Lord Frost and his replacement by being replaced by the Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss. So my first question to you, my friend, is what impact, what significance is there behind the appointment of Liz Truss? Will it make a significant difference to the tone and tenor of the discussions and negotiations taking place between the UK and the European Union?
I mean, there's several bits to that. I mean, first and foremost, my friend Jill Rutter would never forgive me if I didn't mention this. There's a sort of machinery of government implication. This looks quite rational now that Europe and relations with European states is part of broader foreign policy. So in that sense, David Frost's position was a little bit anomalous. This is arguably a little bit less so, but that's really for the future. And there's no doubt that it has changed the tone. You know, the cozy dinner in Shavening, the mood music yesterday. This is a very different sort of atmosphere to the one that prevailed under David Frost, because under David, you'd hear quite frequently from the EU side that actually, you know, his tone wasn't very open. He wasn't particularly warm. There wasn't that human touch. And I think she brings that. The problem is the matters of substance remain exactly as they were. And there, I think, several things mean we're probably going to be playing a waiting game. Firstly, there are the elections coming up in Stormont in May. And I think we're reaching the point, if we haven't already, where people are going to say, look, we're going to have to wait and see what happens with those elections rather than risk unsettling them with dramatic steps beforehand. And secondly, of course, you've got the drama playing out in Downing Street and as of today with the Metropolitan Police. And I just don't think any decision can be taken until we know who's in charge of the country, because ultimately the fate of the protocol is a prime ministerial decision.
So because of what you're basically saying, without saying, is that Liz Truss is also an unofficial contender to replace Boris Johnson if ever he were asked to leave or resign voluntarily from Downing Street, and therefore that's influencing the way she handles the discussions on the Northern Ireland Protocol?
To an extent, yes. I think, you know, the indications are that she will be a candidate, absolutely. And in that sense, it will be unreasonable for her not to be thinking about her short-term tactics for the leadership as part of what she's doing over Northern Ireland. But I think more profoundly, you have to have a prime minister who's willing to take a decision on this to move forward. And I think Boris Johnson at the moment has got a load of other things on his mind and is not going to focus on this yet. And I think, as we'll see with a whole load of things, as we've seen repeatedly with the Levelling Up white paper, cans will get kicked down the road until the immediate political crisis either comes to a head or is behind us.
But also, surely it's in Liz Truss's interest to strike a deal sooner rather than later. You mentioned the Stormont elections. Is that a kind of unofficial deadline by which some kind of a new agreement, whatever you want to call it, will have to be reached?
We've had a number of unofficial deadlines during the course of this process, all of which have been reached and missed. So I'm reluctant to say. I think at this point, the Stormont elections are probably a necessary impediment to get out of the way before an agreement is going to be reached, to be perfectly honest. As for Liz Truss and her calculations, who knows? I don't know. I mean, this is the problem with the electorate for this, or the first round electorate for this particular sort of election, is we just don't know the balance of forces until it kicks off. Whether or not she's dependent on the self-proclaimed Spartans for the vote she needs to get to the second round or not, I just don't know at the moment. And so that is going to play a decisive role, I think, in shaping her attitude.
Right. And for those people watching, and including myself, by the way, who are as much interested in process as substance, as far as you know, maybe I should get Jill Rutter to answer this question. Has she taken more or less, has she inherited the team that Lord Frost had, or is she building her own people around her to advise her?
A little bit of both. What is interesting is one of the things that was very, very important to David and very close to his heart was this idea of Brexit opportunities, the idea of regulatory autonomy post-Brexit, and we should make the most of it. And it was under his impulsion that this new Brexit opportunities unit was created in the Cabinet Office to identify and seize those regulatory opportunities. That's the missing bit of the puzzle as yet, because that obviously hasn't gone into the Foreign Office and is as yet without a minister. So the future of that unit is very much up in the air at the moment, as far as we can tell.
You mentioned the meetings, the high-level meetings between Mary Shekovich and Liz Truss, achieving the grace of favour presence of the British Foreign Secretary just now. And many photographs issued. I put one on the Encompass website recently to illustrate an article as walking the grounds almost like a romantic couple. There seems to be much an effort on the EU side as much as the UK side now to kind of reset the relationship. What do you think about from the EU's perspective? Is that in their interest also to try and set a new tone from their side as well?
I think if you look at some of the shared problems we face, whether it's Ukraine, climate crisis, or whatever, common sense dictates that it's probably going to be easier to address those if we're not shouting at each other at the same time. So yes, I think for both sides, it is a bit of a no-brainer that it will be easier to come to an agreement than not, and it will be better to come to an agreement than not. The problem is they still differ fundamentally in terms of what an acceptable agreement would look like. And that stumbling block, as far as I can see, remains now just as it was under David Frost. The basis of the British position is that command paper, and the basis of the European Union is we're not going to renegotiate the protocol.
Well, I've just been listening to Clément Beaune, the French Europe minister, talking to the media, saying that maybe because he has to say that, of course, France runs the presidency of the European Union. There's a small matter of the French presidential elections in April, of course. But he's also been quite firm that the UK has to comply with the existing protocol in full. Do you see any way around that at all? Because the two sides, as you say, seem pretty entrenched in their respective positions.
I mean, I can imagine a way around. I can imagine a way around which includes greater flexibility from both sides. I can't see that coming about at the moment, to be honest. I mean, what I hear from people on this side is that there is absolutely no sign of the EU position on the nature of checks and the nature of the border softening. In fact, some people have said to me quite the contrary, actually, that the EU position seems to be hardening. And Liz Truss has repeated pretty much what David Frost said about the role of the European Court of Justice, which strikes me as an insuperable stumbling block. And if you really are thinking in terms of your leadership aspirations within the contemporary Conservative Party, then being seen to compromise with Brussels is perhaps not the best way to ensure your success.
Right. I should point out I was slightly remiss at the outset by not reminding people watching that they can post their questions anytime during our conversation, and I can see questions that are already coming in. So I don't think we'll have a kind of separate Q&A session toward the end when I stop monopolizing you, and I'll feed the questions into the discussion as and when they crop up. But for the moment, I still got too many questions to ask you. A lot has been said, especially last year, about the absence of trust, the breakdown of trust between the two sides.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, the Europeans, not just the European Commission, do not trust Boris Johnson. By extension, the rest of his government do not trust the UK positioning on all these matters. Is that an overstatement? Is it too trite to say there's no trust or there's a breakdown in trust, or do you think it's a really serious matter?
I mean, it's a multi-layered issue, isn't it? I mean, on some issues, the UK and its European partners continue to work together quite closely. I think what the fundamental shift is that under this British government, relations with the European Union and indeed with individual European states is not the no-brainer that it has been for successive governments beforehand. And that sort of destabilizes the relationship. You can't count on the fact that ultimately the British government understands it needs to be able to work closely with its European friends. And that sort of takes one of the bedrocks out of the relationship. So I think, yes, there is an element of distrust. We shouldn't forget cooperation in the Sahel and things like that that have been going on. But the relationship is on far less firm footings than it has been historically. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
And well, okay, if that's the reality, then do you see, at least theoretically, any ways to address that? Because but presumably this absence of trust has to be addressed at some point.
I think part of it is just getting used to the new normal. It's very interesting in this country how many commentators have said, "Oh God, if Boris Johnson goes, we will lose Brexit." I think Andrew Adonis tweeted that, if Boris goes, then Brexit goes with it. But people haven't quite wrapped their heads around the fact that we are living with a new normal, which is the UK outside of the European Union. And maybe that will take a little bit of time to get used to. Maybe it will take the heat of battle to dissipate a bit before we can sit down. I mean, one of the things that struck me about the negotiations from day one was that no one really seemed to be thinking, okay, look, legal and political difficulties aside, we are partners who need to figure out a way to working together on a whole raft of issues where, if nothing else, geography determines our interests are aligned. What is a model for allowing us to do that? And we got stuck quite quickly in both the political and the legal minutiae, but we have to come back to that. Ultimately, and I'm not sure what the time frame is, we need to figure out a way to collaborate as closely as we possibly can without rancor. And without thinking in terms of this sort of binary in or out. There's no point thinking it won't work if we're out, because I see no prospect of us being back in. Equally, there's no point thinking we're out so we don't need to work with them, because that is naive.
Well, let's, by the end of this hour, have maybe focus it towards the end of the chat about practical ways, whether or not the government will listen to us about how we can enhance cooperation. And anybody watching, listening to us chatting can put their own suggestions in the chat. Before we move on, we've talked briefly about David Frost almost in the past tense, which is understandable since he's resigned. But there's a question from Adam Isaacs, who's head of unit at the European Parliament, asked, do you, Anand, think that David Frost still harbours ambitions to be a major player on the EU-UK relations scene, possibly as Foreign Secretary under Liz Truss? How likely is he to return to a prominent role, whatever happens to Boris Johnson in the coming weeks?
I mean, what I would say is my guess is precisely that. It's a guess. It's not based on any particular personal knowledge of David Frost. Is no. It was very interesting. We did a long conversation with him almost a year ago now. I think it was March last year. And one of the things he said that stuck in my mind was, I think I'm getting close to having accomplished the stuff I came into politics to accomplish. He gave no hint then of having longer term political aspirations. I think there's no doubt he quite likes the profile he's gained for himself. He quite likes the influence he seems to have for himself. I think it was today again, he was in the headlines for saying how the government has failed to create the low tax entrepreneurial atmosphere that Brexit should have ushered in. So he will be a noisy presence, I think, for the foreseeable future, and I think he's enjoying that. But whether he wants to return to frontline politics, I would be surprised, to be honest.
Okay, and before we move on from the protocol, I promise we will move on to the protocol very soon. A question from Bill Roger, who's the treasurer of the European Movement in Scotland. I'm not sure it's your specialist area, Anand, but how far would a veterinary agreement go to smoothing the protocol problems?
A significant distance, to be honest. It would solve not just the protocol problems, but the problems we're going to have from July on the GB EU border as well. And Keir Starmer has indicated that he would want to sign such an agreement. It's interesting now that you're getting concrete proposals, and we can talk about them towards the end, as you said, for instance, from the British Chamber of Commerce, about ways to make the trade and cooperation agreement work better. And a veterinary agreement is very, very key to that, to making that border work more smoothly than it otherwise would. I should say in parentheses that if you have questions about economics that you want me to have a go at, do it sooner rather than later, because at some point in the next hour, Jonathan Portes is going to come and sit at the desk next door to me. If I talk economics while he's in the office, he just rolls his eyes. So let's get it out of the way before he comes back.
Yeah, okay, we're trying to move on from Northern Ireland, but it's difficult because I now have a question from David Lidington, of course, a very distinguished former senior minister in the May administration, and also Cameron, of course. David Lidington is now chair of the think tank RUSI. And he says, Anand, what impact do you think the outcome of the Stormont elections might have, especially if it were to produce, as seemed likely, a clear majority of MLAs in favour of sticking with the current protocol? Might that give the number 10 Foreign Office the opportunity to say the people have spoken and do a deal?
You would like to think so. I mean, one of the interesting things about Northern Ireland at the moment is, particularly under David Frost, there was a lot of talk from the government about Northern Ireland being in crisis. And you talk to people in Northern Ireland who would say, really? We hadn't really noticed that we were in crisis. And, you know, we published some polling a few weeks ago that showed that whilst a majority of MPs, both Conservative and Labour, want to get rid of the protocol and replace it with something else, a majority of the population in Northern Ireland now think it's working quite well for Northern Ireland. So there is this disjuncture between how Westminster talks about Northern Ireland, how Westminster portrays Northern Ireland, and what Northern Ireland itself seems to be thinking. I suspect, though, of course, the big variable here is we don't know who the British Prime Minister will be when this happens, that the British government will double down whatever the results of the elections in Northern Ireland. There has been a slight tendency to treat elections and government in the devolved authorities with slightly more contempt than I think is healthy on the part of Westminster over the last few years. And to be honest, I suspect that might continue. But actually, David knows the answer to his question better than I do. So if you want to type the answer in there, David, I'll just read it out.
I'll read it out if you don't worry. That's a challenge to you, or an invitation to you, David, if you're still hopefully watching. Moving on slightly, if I may, there's a widespread feeling, you know, that other areas of potential future cooperation between the UK and the EU are being basically held hostage, such as because pending an agreement on the Northern Ireland Protocol. And I'm thinking particularly, of course, of participation in Horizon Europe, but also other research programs like the Copernicus and the Euratom research project as well. It is over a year since the year indicated formally its desire to stay in or continue with its participation in Horizon Europe. But it's still, as I understand it, still waiting to hear a reaction, a positive reaction, certainly from the European Commission. And of course, the suspicion, the very clear suspicion, is that that's the leverage, that the EU is putting leverage on that to put pressure on the UK to find a solution more acquiescent on the protocol. Do you agree with that analysis? And do you think it's an effective way for the EU and the Commission to conduct itself?
I mean, if I were the EU, I would be doing that. I don't see why they wouldn't. If you're stuck in a negotiation, if it's a negotiation in which you think the other side is acting with bad faith and unpicking an agreement they themselves negotiated with you, then you would use every lever at your disposal. And certainly Horizon is one of those levers. I'm not sure how influential it is. I'm not sure how wedded the government is to this either way. They want to participate, but it's not a core concern, I don't think. But yeah, absolutely, I would buy that interpretation that the EU is using this.
But would you agree with that, funny words in your mouth, it's quite serious collateral damage, isn't it? I remember, our last webinar before Christmas, we had Sir Adrian Smith, the head of the Royal Society, taking part in the discussion. And obviously the scientific community, not just in the UK, but outside, is extremely concerned about this kind of standoff, no?
No, absolutely. But I mean, you know, a lot of what Brexit is about is collateral damage, isn't it? It is people having to adjust to A, new trading relationships, and B, profound and chronic uncertainty. And profound and chronic uncertainty is what the research sector is having to tolerate whilst the two sides try and figure this out. That doesn't change the fact that I think from a UK government perspective, that is not the priority. The priority is politics, and politics is the protocol. Right.
Okay, let's talk about what you academics call the governance architecture of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, and I suppose the Joint Committee as well. We're getting quite nerdy. It's difficult to talk about these things without being a tiny bit nerdy. And I have a question already, but also a question from the audience, which I'll quote in a second. Do you have a sense of how these post-Brexit structures of implementation cooperation are working in practice? I mean, they're not particularly newsworthy, I'm sure. What the meetings, they don't get written up in the media, that's for sure. But are they functioning? And linked to that, before you come back, if I can get the question back, Mark Watts, who's a former two-term MEP, now runs a consultancy, very successful consultancy in Brussels, asks about the meetings of the EU-UK Partnership Council. Specialised committees under the TCA, Trade Cooperation Agreement, are being held. What's your take, Anand, on whether any progress is being made in terms of strengthening the EU-UK relationship on matters which could be addressed under the TCA, like the mutual recognition of professional qualifications?
Well, I'd say a couple of things. I mean, I'm not privy to any sort of particular insider information about that. I'm just a spectator like everyone else. You occasionally hear from civil servants who participate, and it strikes me that the meetings are going quite well, in the sense that, they're quite businesslike, they're getting stuff done, they're working well with their counterparts, whether it's UK with their EU counterparts or vice versa. There's some limited progress being made, but I think with member states, about mutual recognition agreements for certain professions, but it's slow and it's cumbersome and it's messy. We're just coming to grips with the fact that fairly simple things are a lot more complicated when you're outside the European Union. I think there was a story in the press the other day about UK nationals being stranded in the European Union because their non-UK spouses have to apply for certain bits of paperwork, and there's a year-long backlog of the Home Office. There is just, ironically, I suppose, for a project that criticised the bureaucratic European Union, Brexit creates a hell of a lot of new bureaucracy and paperwork, and getting to grips with that is going to take a lot of time, and it's going to take even more time in the context of us coming out of a global pandemic. So, I think the structures seem to be working as well as you might expect, but there's no magic bullet, and there's a lot of time and a lot of negotiation needed to sort these things out. And I think in the current context, understandably, there's probably far less attention being given to these things than should be the case. I mean, interestingly enough, you're just starting to get the anecdotes about people trying to travel under the services provision of the TCA and running into bureaucratic walls. I mean, a couple of my friends were due to give lectures or teach courses at EU institutions, and both of them ended up cancelling their trips because they couldn't quite figure out the paperwork that was necessary in order to do this and get paid. So we're going to hear far, far more of this. Travel is starting to open up again. I don't think the full impacts of the services elements of the TCA in particular have been felt as yet. That was a bit of a fudgy answer, for which I apologise.
Not at all. And I did promise the audience that we would take their questions in groups and take them seriously as well. And which means that an awful lot of questions are coming in still about the Northern Ireland Protocol. And John Peet, political Brexit editor of The Economist, has had the temerity to react to David Liddington's question, your answer, Anand, by saying, but a complication is that if Sinn Féin gets the most votes in the Stormont elections in May and claim the first ministership, which may lead the Unionists to collapse the Assembly? Question mark.
It's certainly possible. I mean, it is a very volatile situation. It is very hard to predict what the Unionists would do, but John's absolutely right. There is that potential for the Assembly being collapsed again, which, as we saw before, is quite damaging and doesn't give Northern Ireland its own voice whilst its future is being negotiated.
Yeah, and a linked question, I think we've touched on it, but actually, I think I should quote it anyway, from Ian Dre, I think that's the pronunciation, Ian, of your name, at the Wilfred Martin Centre for European Studies here in Brussels. There is now a clear majority of voters in Northern Ireland who support the protocol. If the forthcoming election, Stormont returns Sinn Féin as the biggest parties we've been discussing, won't this weaken the British position in talks with the EU? I.e., there will have to be an acknowledgement of sentiment in Northern Ireland and not just the vocal opinions of unionist MPs.
I mean, the problem is, in the UK, we tend to only, or the government tends to only think and talk in terms of unionist MPs, which has been a fundamental problem from the start of this process, is forgetting that there are other voices in Northern Ireland. I'm not convinced that under this current government that's going to change, despite the fact that I think you're absolutely right. You would think that an election result like that would put pressure on the British government to do things differently. I'm not convinced that they would.
Right. And still on that, but from a more of a business side, Andrew Jones, who's Senior Government Affairs Manager at Johnson & Johnson, asks, do you think there's any risk to the current EU proposal on medicine supply to Northern Ireland, for instance, if the UK activate any of the provisions in Article 16?
There are always risks because the situation is very unstable. I very much doubt, to be honest, that the EU would want to see that arrangement being cast into doubt. So I would suggest probably not. We've not heard much about Article 16 of late.
Yeah.
As Truss mentioned it in passing. And of course, there was always that issue over Article 16 about whether we were talking about a sort of limited triggering of Article 16 with reference to one or two specific provisions of the protocol, or a more sort of broad-ranging, this isn't working for us, so we're suspending the whole thing. I mean, Article 16 can be triggered in a number of different ways, but I suspect that both sides realise that when it comes to something as fundamental and as politically salient as the medicines thing, that they would both endeavour to make the agreement they have stick, whatever else is going on around the protocol. That would be my guess.
Right. Well, still on the governance of future relations, we talked a bit about the kind of the committees staffed by civil servants, both the Joint Committee and the committees under the Partnership Council. But then a couple of questions about the Parliamentary Partnership Assembly, the PPA, apparently, in the jargon. So let me big up a couple of questions. One is from so the one we had from Mark Watts, and a second question from, bear with me, from Cherry Miller, postdoctoral researcher at the University of Tampere. How might the EU-UK Parliamentary Partnership Assembly gain more softer powers to establish itself as an important body in EU-UK relations?
I think first and foremost by being taken seriously by both sides, by ensuring, that people turn up for the meetings, that you've got a good caliber of MPs who turn up and people who aren't just going to go there and posture. I think taking the organisation seriously is key. But there's a broader point connected with that, is I think, and Paul, you're doing your bit with the forum, and congratulations to you for that, is that, person-to-person contacts at all levels, including amongst parliamentarians, is absolutely fundamental. Whatever the nature of Brexit, we remain neighbours and we remain allies. And actually, one of the worrying things, I think it's been the case for the last decade or so, is you hear of the difficulty of getting Conservative MPs to take part in the kind of bilateral fora that link the UK and the EU. And I think, actually, we've left the European Union now. There's absolutely no reason why they shouldn't develop close personal relationship between politicians on both sides, because it is functional and it is useful and it helps countries work together. So I do hope, and one of the most encouraging things I've seen over the last couple of years is an explicit mention of Königswinter in that Anglo-German declaration that they signed on the occasion of Chancellor Merkel's valedictory trip over here. And I thought that's very, very interesting that it found a place in that document, and I thought it was a good sign. But there is the Parliamentary Assembly which matters, but I think above and beyond that, it is important that policymakers on both sides maintain those relationships and those links.
Right. I suppose the interest of political balance, we should talk about the Labour Party and its stance on future EU relations, and a couple of questions from the audience again. One from Tony Cox, a trustee at the ICA.
This is very stressful,
Sorry. A lot of questions, Anna, a lot of questions. You're doing a great job. Tony Cox's question is, it appears we can no longer look to the Labour Party to pay attention to the problems Brexit continues to throw up. So would a change of government offer any trade advantages? And before you react, I'll give you time to reflect. There's a question also from Dennis McShane, also another former Europe minister, of course, under Tony Blair. How does Labour's statement about no return to the single market for 50 years, he's referring to an interview Rachel Reeves gave in the Financial Times on the 20th of January, play into the desire of the BCC, the British Chamber of Commerce, I suppose it means, and other business groups for a calmer opening of win-win trade with the EU?
Well, I mean, the short answer to Dennis's question is it limits what can be achieved. I think some of the things the British Chamber of Commerce were talking about customs felicitation and possibly around the edges of the VAT regime might still be possible. But yeah, freedom of, it's the same debate. Freedom of movement is a problem which will make the Labour Party, I think, steer clear of anything that smacks of single market membership for quite a while yet. And that sort of brings me back to the sort of first question, which is, if you're a Labour politician and you hear the words problems of Brexit, you don't think problems of trade, you think problems of party management.
Right.
Those problems are real. Labour have to maintain the support of Remain-leaning voters whilst attracting back those Leave-leaning supporters who might have left them in the last election to vote for Boris Johnson. That is not easy. And I think I have a degree of sympathy with a party leadership that says banging on about Brexit is probably not the best way to do that. What I think we will see over the next few months is that Labour, and you see it already under Rachel to an extent, far more so than you saw under Annalisa Dodds, is an attempt to tie Brexit into a broader narrative about government economic failure. Right. That is to say, in terms of a cost of living crisis, in terms of the potential for shortages, the potential for greater trade disruption when those final checks are brought in July, Labour will have put themselves in a position where at least now they can talk about Brexit, but not talk about Brexit per se, talk about the government's Brexit deal. And it strikes me, given the divisions within the Labour Party and the tensions between Labour voters on the issues of Brexit, that is a politically sensible direction to go in. That is to say, rather than talking about Brexit per se and triggering that values divide that works so well for Boris Johnson and divides the Labour Party so completely, you reframe Brexit as a matter of economic management and you incorporate it into a critique of a government that you are saying has not got the competence to manage the economy in the best interest of the British people. And I suspect we will see more of that. That will only mean limited suggestions in terms of UK-EU relationships. It won't go much further, I don't think, than a veterinary agreement and maybe a few tiny things on top of that. But it is, I think, significant in the sense that Labour are at last now thinking about a way to utilise Brexit as a form of attack on the government, albeit that won't please those who are clamouring to rejoin.
So this reframing of the narrative, it's a relatively new phenomenon, I presume. Does it coincide with the promotion of Rachel Reeves to become Shadow Chancellor? Or is it just a coincidence?
Well, it does coincide, but I suppose it could be a coincidence. The tone definitely changed under Rachel Reeves, and Keir Starmer has spoken about the fact of being willing to sign up, for instance, for that veterinary agreement. So on the one hand, they are coming up with specific counter proposals to deepen cooperation and to make the TCA work better. On the other hand, Labour are turning everything now, and quite cleverly, I think, into a debate about the cost of living crisis. So, for instance, even on Partygate, these parties that were held in Downing Street during lockdown, Labour are linking those to the cost of living crisis. So I think that they found their angle and will incorporate Brexit into that with a whole host of other things.
But do you still think Labour Party is slightly running a scare, the Labour shadow front bench, in terms of anything they say which hints at or just talks about and objectively about how the fact that Brexit is not exactly going smoothly gives them a hostage to fortune and they lays them open to attack by their enemies? It seems they're quite cowardly or quite frick. They're not particularly keen to go down that road.
Cautious, yeah, definitely. I don't think there's any great political risk to saying that Brexit isn't going smoothly, because a significant proportion of the British electorate think that Brexit is not going well. One of the things we saw just before Partygate actually was, for the first time since he became Prime Minister, a majority of Leave supporters thought Boris Johnson was doing a poor job as Prime Minister. So that you can see the signs of tension in that Brexit coalition. But I think the trick that Labour have adopted is not to talk about Brexit, but to talk about the Prime Minister's Brexit deal, which is a fundamentally different debate.
Yeah. Okay. Well, going brief back to Dennis mentioning the British Chamber of Commerce, and do you have any sense that the business community in the UK, and to be fair, any other stakeholders for that matter, are much more outspoken now? As you know, historically, since in the run of the referendum campaign, never mind since the result of 5.5 years ago now, business has always complained about not being given a good hearing in Downing Street. And do you think now they are speaking out because the evidence is so compelling and it's having an impact on the government, or not?
I think it's partly because the evidence is compelling. I don't think anyone who thought about it is particularly surprised by the evidence. I think we could have predicted most of what we are seeing at the moment in terms of Brexit impacts. I think more there is a sense, rightly or wrongly, that there is an opening now, and that it might be the time to start to try and reason with government about softening the edges of the TCA. You've got a more receptive audience in the figure of Keir Starmer than you had previously. And so I think it's that political sense that business groups are responding to. I don't think if you went to the British Chamber of Commerce and said, are you surprised by what's happening? And is this making you sort of reassess? They'd say, absolutely not. We're not surprised in the least.
Right. Okay, let's move on to, if I may, to foreign security policy. As you know, the UK was quite adamant in the negotiations leading up to the TCA that there would be no formal chapter or discussion of formal cooperation, at least on foreign security policy in the new agreement. Although I'm sure there's some wording somewhere. Richard Corbett mentioned recently there are words, there is some language about cooperation in the future. And the UK, as you know, even the civil servants, never mind politicians, get kind of irritated by the EU because they claim that the EU is more about form than substance, and so the UK always feel slightly suspicious or even nervous they're going to be sucked into some kind of new structured cooperation in the foreign security field. Do you think that the UK is right to have that suspicion? Is it sustainable? And of course, given Ukraine, and we're getting questions now from the audience also about Ukraine, that situation has to change. Specifically, Olivier Marty, lecturer at Sciences Po and École Normale Supérieure, Institut Montaigne in Paris, asks, how do you assess the impact of the current context between the EU and the UK to affect coordination on the Ukrainian crisis, for example, a very specific and very topical and very serious issue at the moment?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I noticed some remarks by Tony Gardner, Barack Obama's ambassador to the European Union, in which he seemed to imply that because of Brexit, the UK is in a better position to act decisively in foreign policy. And I was slightly taken aback because, you know, I'm old enough to remember Iraq. When it comes to foreign policy, member states tend to do what they want, except in a few specific areas, I think sanctions, for instance. So I've never believed that the EU was a particular constraint on national foreign policies. I think in terms of what I would like to see, I think it is a shame that we no longer have the ability to interact regularly with Europeans on matters of foreign policy. One of the great strengths of EU membership was the fact that the foreign policy people from member states spent a lot of time together and got to know each other's positions well. And you think just intuitively that has got to help them in times of crisis understand each other and craft compromises between each other. And I do hope that we find institutionalized mechanisms of keeping the UK in the loop with other European member states. That's really important.
Yeah, so interrupt, but truly behind the scenes, I'm not a foreign security expert, that's for sure, but one hears anecdotally quite behind the scenes, again, not either too sensitive, too confidential, or even just maybe not newsworthy enough, signs of quite a lot of cooperation between the UK and at least some of the larger member states. Obviously, the famous E3 format between Germany, France, and UK on dealing with Iran, for example. So it's not as if the two sides are ignoring each other. Sure, no. It's done more bilaterally.
No, absolutely not. But there's something to be said for institutionalized links that bring regular meetings of certain officials so that there's a rhythm and a sort of predictability to it. And that, I think, is what we've lost by not signing up to any sort of foreign policy deal with the European Union. As of now, I don't see any disagreements between European states, meaning both EU and the UK, that wouldn't have been in evidence had the UK still been a member state of the European Union, to be perfectly honest. I think those divisions are there, they're real. There are very different approaches to dealing with Russia. There are very different approaches to the legitimacy of the use of force in international relations, as we've seen with Germany. I'm one of those people that actually, apart from the sort of importance of the human interaction, doesn't think that Brexit has made a huge amount of difference to how the West and Europe in particular have responded to what's going on.
But isn't the argument, the counter argument that, and that the UK has done more, and very recently to support Ukraine by sending material equipment and even troops maybe to the country, where in a way that the EU is still wringing its hand, trying to find a consensus of what is feasible, what is not feasible as EU 27. Maybe that's what Tony Gardner was referring to, maybe.
But my question would be, I don't see as that would be any different if the UK were still an EU member state. Our position on Russia was always sort of, in the recent past, on the hawkish end of the spectrum. We were the voice talking for tougher sanctions against Russia in the Council. We've lost that influence, that ability to weigh on internal EU discussions. But I'm not sure materially our own foreign policy stance would be different if we were in or if we were out.
Well, if we're talking about foreign security policy, I mean, although the EU likes to think it is the center of the universe, it is not in all matters the center of the universe. And so we have to talk briefly about NATO, of course, where the UK claims to be, and can, with some accuracy, claim to be a serious member and an influential member of NATO, despite Brexit, or irrespective of Brexit, and opportunities for these high-level discussions you talked about before, which are absent now at the EU level because of the UK departure, do nonetheless still take place in the context of NATO. Defense ministers and foreign ministers, they meet all the time. They're ambassadors, of course, and discussing Ukraine, obviously. So it's not as if the EU is the only game in town when it comes to foreign security issues.
No, absolutely. Though I think you can't overstress the fact that NATO is not what it once was, because, you know, we can no longer rely on the Americans in the way we thought we once could. You know, it's impossible to exaggerate the degree to which the fact of having the Trump presidency has undermined the Western security alliance for a number of reasons. Firstly, because it's that is only ever an election away, which means that we need to start thinking about what happens if we get another Trump presidency or something like a Trump presidency. And the fact of the matter is that Trump has affected the content of American foreign policy significantly. America First is alive and well. Joe Biden hasn't proven himself to be the greatest of multilateralists, at least. So in that sense, this was unfortunate timing for the United Kingdom, because there are important choices that we're currently putting off that we're going to need to make, in the sense that the integrated review quite rightly stresses the centrality of Euro-Atlantic security in terms of our security interests. But we haven't, I don't think, really started to get to grips with how best to ensure those security interests, given the newfound fragility of the Western alliance that involves the United States.
Are you encouraged or cynical about initiatives like that of Mr. Macron to talking about a European Security Council, which would allow you, if it ever saw the light of day, would include or allow at least UK membership thereof?
I'd be encouraged if I thought it was going to happen. I suspect there's going to be significant pushback within the European, and there already has been significant pushback within the European Union. The problem with all those sorts of things, the problem, just thinking back to the early stages of the negotiations with Iran in 2003 with the E3 format, was it was quite hard to carry off in the teeth of quite vociferous opposition from some of the, not just the small member states, but some of the medium-sized states like Italy and Spain that felt they were being unfairly pushed to one side. I think any arrangement that allows for sort of systematic, institutionalized, structured dialogue and cooperation between the UK and its European allies is a good thing. But I suspect there are limits to how far EU member states will go. You know, this is something that, again, going back to that Anglo-German declaration, the Germans wanted written there sort of, in blood. Nothing we do with the United Kingdom is going to undermine the centrality of the European Union. And I think that tension will limit our ability to make things like a sort of E3 or a Security Council type operation work.
Right. It's not quite the theme of our talk, but I think it's only fair to ask you the question anyway, if I can quickly find it, from Richard Wilson, Vice Chair of the European Movement in the UK. Have any Brexit opportunities been identified yet, bearing in mind that it is now almost 6 years since the referendum? What do you think? What do you say?
Yes. I mean, I think if you look in the area of agriculture, the new incentives for farmers have the potential to make a real difference environmentally. I mean, there are big question marks over the new structures, for instance, whether farmers will be given sufficient support to shift from one system to another. So the key to that is going to be how generous the government is in easing that. But areas like that, yep, we've definitely seen sort of regulatory independence taken, being grasped across the board. Nowhere near as much as we were promised, absolutely. Which is, listen to David Frost and his disappointment about that. The other areas where I think we're seeing the signs of a plan are in financial services, for instance, where sort of green finance is something the Treasury is very, very keen on. And those areas where the Treasury is the dominant sort of ministry seem to have better thought through plans than some of the others, I have to say. And financial services is one of those. There seems to be an emergent vision of making UK financial services more competitive, taking advantage of things like green finance to reinforce the role of the City of London. Across the board, though, the picture is at best mixed. We've got a report coming out on Monday, actually, on public policy after Brexit. And I think whilst, you know, in a few flagship areas, immigration is one area where our new independence has been acted upon because we had to have a replacement to freedom of movement. And there's been some quite dramatic action there in terms of the liberalising of our immigration policy for non-Europeans. But across the board, the picture is still as yet quite limited. Though I would say, yes, it's 6 years since the referendum. It's only a couple of years since we left the European Union itself. We've had, at best, we can say, unstable politics for most of those 6 years. And of course, then we had a pandemic. So perhaps it is something it would be unfair to have expected too much to have happened as yet, though there are some signs, albeit I remain skeptical of the idea that regulatory gains can come anywhere close to compensating for the economic impacts of leaving the single market and the customs union.
Right. I'm going to devote the last few minutes of our chat to these ideas, these structures we talked about at the very beginning about how things could be done differently in the future. So not just diagnose and talk about all the problems, but let's try and find solutions. Before we come to that, though, we touched on briefly on NATO, and as you know, I think the UK is quite keen beyond the global Britain mantra, which often is derided. Sometimes people would say, rightfully so, to talk about there are other players in town, yes, apart from the EU. And the G7 is seen as a forum for the UK to exert influence, even though it's just given up its presidency last year. It's still obviously still a member of the G7 and the G20, obviously, and they trying to maybe construct not just a new narrative, but a new way of talking about global affairs to maybe, since the UK is no longer inside the European Union, to what extent is the G7 a new platform that could be reformatted and reviewed to be a way for the UK to exert influence on the world stage?
I mean, one of the problems with foreign policy, like much else that's going on in the UK, is everything is so political and politicized at the moment. Global Britain and actions towards global Britain were clearly part of an attempt to prove something about Brexit rather than something thought through in foreign policy terms, pure and simple. But it's very, very hard to know how long they will last. Everything is so prone to fluctuate on the back of political whim. There was certainly scope for the UK to be more active in foreign policy, because as far as I can see, from several years before the referendum, we'd effectively ceased to have a foreign policy. I mean, probably since the Syria vote, the UK didn't really have a foreign policy that was easy to identify. So actually doing more internationally, being more aware of international geopolitical risks is a good thing. What I find hard to define is looking forward, particularly if we end up with a new prime minister, how central those ambitions will continue to be for any new British government, because we know this is no longer a time when you sort of define British foreign policy interests and pursue them over the medium term, to the extent we ever did that. This is a time of fluctuation where everything is political and used instrumentally for political purposes. So it's too soon to say, I think. I mean, I was always quite skeptical about last year. I mean, last year was a big year for British foreign policy, wasn't it? Because you had the G7, you had the COP26, you even had the chairmanship of the Security Council. But whether the Prime Minister's interest in foreign affairs would extend beyond a period when he was front and centre was always, for me, open to doubt. And it still is open to doubt, quite frankly. I hope that answers your question. I just droned on a bit there, didn't I?
No, well, it is a new area. We all need to get our hands around to what extent G7 is relevant or not in this context. As the last questioner said, it is almost 6 years since the UK voted to leave, and although you say it's only 2 years in effect, we have actually really left, quote unquote. Nonetheless, a whole generation of young people have not known membership, British young people membership of the EU. And there's a question from a student, Alison Menon, who says, what are we going to do to educate future generations who have no first-hand knowledge of EU membership about our relationship with Europe? What message do they risk being taught, and by whom? And maybe wearing your other hat as professor of European politics and international relations, do you see that students have less interest in studying EU affairs?
Not as yet, no. I mean, from the institutions I know, so King's first and foremost, we've had no impact on applications from EU nationals that we can tell. The courses are fully subscribed. We have far more students now than we used to have, partly because of what happened during the pandemic. Looking forward, I don't know. I mean, I don't think the students I taught both here and at Birmingham and indeed at Oxford before then on European studies courses studied European studies primarily because they were interested in the UK's relationship with the European Union. They did it because they were interested in the European Union. And the one thing we can be certain of is the European Union will continue to be fascinating as a unique experiment, long into the future. So I hope that interest will persist. I hope that interest will persist, particularly as the younger generation becomes more energized by things like the climate crisis, where the EU has a massive role to play. So at the moment, things look all right. I mean, obviously for British students now, we'll have to see what happens with the Turing scheme. There are going to be far fewer opportunities to go to European countries, and they'll be encouraged by this government to look further afield. That's something where other organizations are going to have to look to try and fill those gaps and to encourage young people to spend more time in Europe and getting to know other European countries.
Well, you're obviously talking about Erasmus and the UK departure from the Erasmus program. Again, talking to civil servants, UK civil servants, they would say that it is a shame that there could not be an agreement arrived at in the final stages of negotiations with Barnier and co. And also the UK would say that, well, we weren't getting a particularly good return on investment, and that the EU was quite inflexible in trying to change the terms of engagement. And do you have any sympathy that do you have any insight whether you thought the UK civil servants negotiating teams did try quite hard to stay inside Erasmus, but it was not to be because of the inflexibility of the people on the other side of the negotiating table?
I've got no idea what happened in the negotiations, but I would say it goes far more broad than just Erasmus. I think the notion, for instance, that the UK decided not to accept identity cards from European citizens who wanted to travel over here is, as I think Peter Foster has documented this several times, both on Twitter and in the newspaper, is going to have a dramatic impact on the number of school kids visiting the United Kingdom from EU member states. And that, I don't think, can possibly be a good thing, and I would hope it's one of the things that we are able to revisit going forward.
Right. We have a question from Eva Radomska of University Krakow. We are focusing on the relationship between the UK and the European Union, but could I go beyond, says Eva, beyond that to the wider international scene? Does the UK actually have a clear strategy for strengthening its position in Asia? Is this region actually in the UK's area of interest, or is it just post-Brexit announcements? In my view, says Eva, it is more important for the UK businesses to have better relations with the UK and access to the single market than distant Asian markets.
I think in economic terms, Eva, you're absolutely right. Whatever trade deals we sign with countries in Asia, however fast the rate of growth might be in Asia, our relationship with the single market and the customs union is going to be far more consequential in terms of economics, simply because of distance. That being said, I think it makes rational sense to focus far more, as the UK government is doing, on the Indo-Pacific, both as an area of economic growth, less importantly, and more importantly, as a centre of potential instability in international relations going forward. It's no coincidence that other major European countries, the French and the Germans, are starting to prioritize that region as well. That seems to be the region where a lot of the sort of focus of international diplomacy is going to be in years to come, and that makes perfect sense. Whether the UK can do this in splendid isolation, or whether down the line we're going to have to do something in collaboration with European allies, I tend to think the latter rather than former. The problem is, under this government, that's not going to happen because these things are simply too politicized. But I think ultimately the UK is going to have to repair its relationship in the Indo-Pacific with the French, that suffered so badly because of AUKUS. And I think that European states are going to have to collaborate if they really are serious about wielding any influence at all.
Right. We keep being dragged back to Northern Ireland Protocol. I'm determined to spend the last 5 minutes of our chat talking about the future and remedies and ideas and creative stuff. But Chris Taylor, head of the Northern Ireland desk at the UK Mission DU, asked the question, which I feel duty bound to put to you, Anand, as follows: do you think the unprecedented governance framework for the Northern Ireland Protocol, where the UK as a third country can be infracted as if it is a member state, can be sustainable in the long term? Forgive my ignorance, I don't know what infracted means in this context. Maybe you do.
I think that depends on the politics. At the moment, it doesn't look sustainable. No, because we have a government that is virulently opposed to that principle of any ECJ jurisdiction whatsoever. However, the fact of the matter is we tried and failed to come up with a better method of dealing with that famous Northern Ireland trilemma. And in a sense, that's going to have to last, certainly from the EU's perspective, until we come up with another option. Another option is, at the moment, unthinkable. So it's hard to imagine it lasting, but equally, it's even harder to imagine an alternative that can deal with that issue of Northern Ireland. I would hope that over time, with perhaps a softening of the EU's approach to some of the checks across that border, you can find a modus vivendi where both sides tolerate something that is far from ideal to them. But ultimately, it is very, very difficult to see a compromise that will suit both sides' stated objectives on that.
Right.
That was a total cop-out, for which I apologise.
No, well, don't worry. I'm sure Chris is happy with that. We have 4 minutes to address the following. Let's do a brief mind experiment, Anand, that the Northern Ireland Protocol is sorted. We don't talk about it ever again. The two sides miraculously find some agreement, and we talk about the future in positive, constructive, optimistic terms, both sides equally. What kind of world are we talking about in that context? You talked about sort of organized structures. I think you're quite keen on having structured cooperation with these elite gatherings like Königswinter, Anglo-French Colloque, the Pontignano Conference. But again, just think to the future beyond the current tensions on the NIP, how UK collaboration could look like in the not too distant future.
Well, I think, as we touched on before, so I won't go into in detail now, far more can be done in the area of foreign and defence policy cooperation to ensure, not just interoperability, but that the two sides work together, plan together. And I think, events might take care of that anyway. I mean, if you imagine, for instance, that we had another Libya-type crisis, a crisis that was, in a sense, too big for the EU and too small for NATO, didn't directly involve the United States, and I think the French and the British will be forced to work together to deal with it. So foreign policy is one area where I think more can be done. I think we missed an opportunity not to make more of the anniversary of the Lancaster House Treaty. I mean, the politics got in the way there, but that's the sort of bilateral relationship where I think we can do a lot more in those areas of foreign security policy. On the economic relationship, I really don't see that there's that much that can be done apart from the sorts of tinkering we've talked about, the veterinary agreement, some steps towards customs facilitation. Those things become easier as the two sides get used to working with each other and as hopefully relationships based on trust are rebuilt. But I think politics in this country means it's very, very hard to see anything more ambitious than that in the short to medium term.
But do you think that there's scope more then given the politics is the politics, we can't get around that, and let's not be coy about that. The current government is not interested, for the moment at least, in those kind of discussions you're talking about. But beyond that, without being too naive, groups like your own organization, UK Changing Europe, these bilateral events you're talking about, these sometimes quite elite gatherings, but still very important, and other civil society organizations can do more to keep the dialogue and the lines of communication open, or they're not really, at the end of the day, particularly helpful, because until the government changes its way of doing things, it's not going to be effective?
No, they're incredibly helpful. I mean, people to people links are what this whole thing is about. After all, it's about people talking, it's about people trading, it's about people getting to know each other. There is no reason why that shouldn't continue to be the case post-Brexit. It's just that it will take far, far more effort post-Brexit, because the kinds of interactions that were necessitated by membership no longer are. So actually, it takes a little bit more effort by people who are interested in that kind of thing to make sure that they happen. But it doesn't need to be just an elite thing. It applies every bit as much to those school kids I was talking about earlier as it does to the people who go to the colloque.
Right. Okay. Well, we reached the top of the hour. Thank you very much, Anand. You managed to survive that grilling with your usual elegance and articulate way of handling all the questions. My thanks to all the audience, people in the audience who have been watching us for the past hour. Those of you in particular also asked questions. Big thank you to Anand, obviously. A recording of this will be available on our website and on YouTube very, very shortly. So tell all your friends, all of you watching who couldn't make it, they can watch it afterwards and get even more of Anand's sagesse and great wisdom. Thank you again, Professor Menon, and good
Thank
day.
you, Paul.
Bye-bye.